Federalist 48, Part 2. We continue with Madison's look at separation of powers, which would guarantee rule of law, and that itself will acknowledge that when you will give power to people, even good people, ambition might drive them to use that power just for their own good and sake, contrary to what's good for the society. Okay? So I'm going to start reading paragraph 2. It is agreed on all sides that powers properly belonging to one of the departments ought not to be directly and completely administered by either of the other departments. It is equally evident that none of them ought to possess, directly or indirectly, an overruling influence over the others in the administration of their respective powers. It will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature. See, he doesn't say power in the hands of X or Y. He says just power generally is of an encroaching nature, and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. Regardless of who has the power, whether it's a good person now, you have to make sure that the person does not use that power to overstep his or her bounds, to overstep the bounds of the responsibility given to him or her. It's just that power has a tendency to corrupt even the good people. After discriminating, therefore, in theory, the several classes of power, as they may in their nature be legislative, executive, or judiciary, the next and most difficult task is to provide some practical security for each against the invasion of the others. What this security ought to be is the great problem to be solved. So this is what we need to work on. What is it that not just in theory, but in practice will check people, will stop people from overstepping their bounds of authority? So theory is one thing, but what happens in reality? Remember, in the last paper, he looked at what had happened in England over the years. Then he looked at what had happened in 13 states over the last 11 years after the revolution. How the constitutions were written and how sometimes it really, well, he didn't say it in Federalist 47. In Federalist 47, he just talked about how partial agency has been given to every one of those departments to stop the other departments from overstepping their bounds. But here he's going to give you an example towards the end of this paper of how in Virginia and Pennsylvania, on paper, the Constitution looks good, keeps people from overstepping their authority or lawful bound, but in practice is a different story. Next paragraph. Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments in the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? Parchment barrier is the law on the books, the law, whether it's constitution or state written law. It says these are, at the end of the day, if there is not a method of checking people and watching over them, they will just look at it like a parchment. They can tear it up, they can overstep it, And it really doesn't mean anything if people in power are not going to respect it. This is the security which appears to have been principally relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated. Again, he says experience. We're going to look at what experience teaches us, not theory, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. Look at the word he uses, impetuous vortex. Just sucks you in. Once they grab at that power, the legislature is the one we have to watch out for in a representative democracy. It's no longer the executive branch, the governors. But he's going to say why you need to watch out for the for the legislature's overreach. The next paragraph, the founders of our republics, he's talking about the 13 different states, have so much merit for the wisdom which they have displayed that no task can be less pleasing than that of pointing out the errors into which they have fallen. A respect for truth, however, obliges us to remark that they seem never for a moment to have turned their eyes from the danger to liberty, from the overgrown and all-grasping prerogative of an hereditary magistrate, supported and fortified by an hereditary branch of the legislative authority. They seem never to have recollected the danger from legislative usurpations, which by assembling all power in the same hands must lead to the same tyranny as is threatened by executive usurpations. So before our revolution, we were always worried that the king or the king's cabinet will overstep their bounds, will concentrate power, will overreach. But the founders of these 13 republics, right after the revolution, they thought, well, since in the past the executive had a tendency to gather power in their hands, what we're going to do is take power away from the governors and give it to the legislative branch. And they made the legislative branch almost the king. And now, after 11 years, we see what a mess that has been. How the legislature has at various times, overstepped its bounds. Remember, Publius thinks that people's passion gets the better of them. In other words, when you give power into their hands or their representatives, and they feel like, well, I'm going to do this for whoever who elected me, and I'm going to do what's best for them because they love me, because they chose me to be here. I don't need to care for other people, people in the community, in the larger community. I'm going to do whatever it takes. And before you know it, they start getting the role of that monarch, the role of that king, the role of that ever more powerful person that gets to their head. And that's what we have to worry about. That's why we need what he calls partial agency in every department to be a check on other departments. Because if we keep them 100% separate, then if one department oversteps its bound, how are the other two departments going to stop him? So we'll continue in the next video.